Committee will come to order. First of all, committee, we will have under consideration House Bill 1 with Representative Monks. I am going to allow House Bill 1 and RS 28268 to be held in conjunction at the same time. Representative Monks will walk you through the process that he went through with House Bill 1 and then why we have RS 28268. So with that, Representative Monks.
Thank you, Chairman and committee. Always going first just makes it a little bit tougher here for you. Get my papers separated out, but appreciate the opportunity to present this bill and RS in conjunction at the same time. Just makes things a little easier, I think, when we go through and try to understand what we're doing here and not confuse the issues if I'm able to talk about them both at the same time. So I appreciate that opportunity. So what maybe I will do is start off with just kind of a brief background. It hasn't been too long since I introduced what is now House Bill 1, and I'll just kind of give you the highlights of what we're thinking of doing that and why we're thinking of doing that, at least. And then I'll go through and explain the differences between the new RS and House Bill 1. So I think we all have learned quite a bit over the last year as far as relationships, and we've had concerns, and I think throughout the country there's been concerns with regards to balance of powers and separation of powers, and where one stops, where one begins, and specifically in Idaho, what role the legislature plays during emergencies. And this legislation, I think, is an attempt to try to help define those lines and restore some separation and checks and balances. Really is our system of government was set up with checks and balances, and I think that was missing during our latest worldwide, I guess, problems with COVID. And so this is an attempt to try to fix some of the problems that we saw. One of the first things that I think that it does that's really important is it says that all jobs are essential. And that's something that I think is really important to me and to a lot of the people of Idaho. To be told that your job is not important when your job puts money into your pocket and food on your table just doesn't sit right with me. Seems like that would be pretty essential to my family, to put food on my table for my family, and to say that the stimulus money that was sent out to individuals and families was sufficient to cover their needs for the last 10 months is pretty laughable, I think. And not everybody was able to qualify for all of the benefits that were, available to businesses or available to individuals or to everything else. And so the fact that this legislation says that all jobs are essential, I think, is very important. Another thing that it does is it provides a stop or a limit to how long these emergency declarations can go without the legislature being involved. Currently, they've just been renewed month after month after month. And in some circumstances, I think that's very appropriate, but for us not to be involved and never have a say in that, I think is not appropriate, and I think the legislature needs to be involved in that. And so an emergency declaration can run for 30 days, and then it has to be extended by the legislature. And I think that's appropriate. Also put limits on how much can be spent during an emergency. So we have sections of code, existing sections of code, that we're not even really changing or touching. And if I get to the right page on that, I can tell you exactly what that section of code is, 46105A. And in that section of code, it says we've got this account set up for emergencies that in case an emergency comes up, we allow the executive branch to spend, up to 1% of our general fund. And that was suspended during this last emergency. And I find that interesting. We had a code specifically designed for emergencies and said during an emergency we can spend so much money, but we're going to suspend that during an emergency. And that just didn't seem appropriate. So we're making sure that that is clear. Can't be suspended for an emergency. One of the things it does is it puts a prohibition on something that I never would have thought you needed to put a prohibition on. I would never have imagined that during an emergency that our constitutionally protected rights could be suspended. Never in my mind did I imagine that that would be the case. And I tried to think of, World War III, invasions, all of those things. At what point do we say that your rights no longer exist? And I couldn't come up with anything in my mind which made me feel like that would be appropriate. And so this legislation makes sure that during a declared emergency, your U.S. constitutional rights defined by the Idaho State Constitution, can't be suspended. And just for good measure, we made sure that peaceable assembly and free exercise of religion was also included in that list. One of the confusions that also came out was, the different attorneys weighed in, and whether from the state or elsewhere, whether or not regulation meant that you can change laws and rules. And one of the determinations was that, yep, regulation means laws and rules. I don't know that, I didn't necessarily think that it meant that. So we made sure that was clear, that regulations mean rules, and you can't change laws during a declared emergency. That's what the legislature's purpose is. And we saw that during this last summer when we needed to change a law with regards to some elections. The legislature was called in a couple of days. We made some good changes. If you talk to at least the county clerks that I had talked to, expressed thanks and said that was great. It was very helpful for us. We were able to have a smooth election process, and it worked. And so to me, that's just kind of an example of, hey, this is how it's supposed to work, and it does work if given that opportunity. And so again, this legislation, that's what it does. And I guess the last thing here, it does put that time limit on any declared emergency if they're declared under this section of code, and they can only last for 30 days, and then they're terminated. That's what this legislation does. Now, I'll back up a little bit and kind of give you a brief description of what was changed between House Bill 1 and RS 28-2888.
Excuse me, Representative Monks, it's
yes,
28268, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Sorry.
I just wanted to clarify for the committee. 288 will be heard
That's the next one.
Okay.
Which I'm not talking about right now. Thank you, Chairman, for clarifying that for me. So if you go on line 10 there, at one point we were striking the words "under this act," and from the original language, House Bill 1 struck those. We put those back in underneath the RS. We also kind of moved the order around a little bit. So the line on 19 and 20, and where it exists, again, existing language says that if he finds a disaster has occurred, or that the occurrence of the threat thereof is imminent, that language was moved up to line 12 area there. Line 33, one of the changes in House Bill 1 said that under the authority of this subsection, the governor under the authority of this subsection must simultaneously terminate. And we felt that a little bit better wording was that the governor under the authority of this subsection are simultaneously terminated. So it's just indicating that it's happening as opposed to, an action by the governor, because those three preceding conditions had nothing to do with whether or not the governor had decided to do those things. For example, the time period expired, and so when the time period expired, it makes sense that the declaration would immediately terminate, and so that's why that language was changed there. Line 36, the notice must be, it said we changed it to the notice must immediately be terminated there. Page 2, line 14, and again, this is all on the RS. If you just read through the RS, it all reads smoothly, but these are just the differences between the two. And so far you can see there's really no substantial changes, but just some editing that we thought may be appropriate. And this section of code, if you start on line 12, I guess, for reading, it says the concurrent resolution may impose conditions for either the termination or extension, and the governor must abide by the terms. Also inserted after the governor, their state agencies, governmental entities, political subdivisions, to make sure that it was clear that, the declaration that may have directed agencies to do something, well, they also have to abide by the concurrent resolution changes there. So again, that made sense as well. And then down in line 42, we added some additional language that really existed already in section 1 of the very first page, where it talked about that the governor may declare proclamations if there is the the need to protect life and property, and that there's an imminent threat. And so we added that language also in subsection 5. It was a little unclear whether or not we were granting additional rights, or that condition didn't have to exist, that was already identified in section 1. We just reaffirming that applies to the whole section of code. And so that was some changes there. Page 3, line 15. When a area has been evacuated for whatever catastrophe, subsection F says that you can prescribe routes and modes of transportation and destinations. And if you've evacuated out of an emergency zone and you are out of that zone and your grandma lives a couple blocks away, or they've got the gym opened at the local high school, 3 blocks the other direction, you should be able to go where you want after you're out of that evacuated zone. So the destination of where you go, totally appropriate to recommend those destinations, but not necessarily appropriate to prescribe that location. And prescribe is a legal term that has more consequence. So we added in recommend. And if you go down to the bottom of page 3, on line 46, the language there, it says that that during one of these disaster emergency declarations, the state shall, not impose, and we add these restrictions or restrict these various things, and we said impose or enforce. And so that just kind of clarifies that, they're not going to do that. Page 4, if you go down to line 5, and this is something that actually is probably appropriate for any time that we put in a severability clause. And it was kind of interesting when some of the attorneys that were looking at this said, I thought we used to do it this way, but for some reason we've not. And it said that if any provision, parts of this is declared invalid, then such declaration shall not affect the validity of the remaining portions. Well, declared invalid by who and what? And so we added in there by a court of competent jurisdiction. Now, there were a few other grammatical changes, I think an and or commas inserted here and there that LSO felt was appropriate. And so those changes were also put in there. But the legislation does the same thing. I don't think any of those things significantly changed it, and that's why the good chairman there allowed and thought it was appropriate to discuss them both at the same time, simply because those didn't change the point of what we were trying to do or the purpose of this legislation. And I've already probably talked way too much, and you guys are tired of hearing from me, so I'd like to hear from you and be happy to answer some questions that you may have for me.
Thank you, Representative Monks. Just for the edification of the committee, the changes that you made in RS 28268 were a result of meeting with members of this committee that wanted some of those wording changes made, as well as you have ground truth those with the Senate. You and I think it was Representative Young, were in a meeting to do that. So are there questions for Representative Monks? Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Monks, I have a couple different questions, and I can just go through them one by one if the chairman wishes. Do you want to just do one at a time?
Let's do one at a time. Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Monks, on page 2.
Representative Scott, are we on House Bill 1 or are you on RS 28268?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm on the RS.
Okay. So committee will be on RS page 2.
And so on page 2, down about line 16, 17, you talk about, you added state agencies, government entities, political subdivisions. And what I'm concerned about is that we're not calling out regional entities such as health districts, which were a big problem. Can you tell me what regional health districts would fall under if it's considered a state agency, a government entity, or a political subdivision?
Representative Monks.
Thank you, Chairman. I think that could be defined as either a governmental entity or a political subdivision. I think they fall within those jurisdictions. That I don't think that's a. I think they're included in this list. Is my point.
That's correct. Yep. Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to double, triple, quadruple check on that one. And then on page 3, the line 23, H, suspend or limit the sale, dispensing, or transportation of alcoholic beverages, explosives. Can you explain why you chose to keep that section in there? Why we would want to allow the governor to suspend the sale and dispensing and transportation of alcohol?
Representative Monks.
Thank you, Chairman. And Representative Scott, being that was existing language, I did not do any research as to why that may have been put in the first place. I'm assuming the legislature at the time had a good reason for that. I just didn't go back and do any research, and so being that I didn't have any knowledge on why that was put in to begin with, I didn't feel that it was appropriate for me to try to pull something out without understanding that fully, and I just haven't. But I would point out, or maybe comment, if I could opine a little bit, that this is not everything that I think we learned from our last 10 months. I think this is a part of what we learned, and I think there's lots of parts that maybe even in this existing language and in other sections of code, I should have said in this existing code and in other sections of code that need to be fixed and addressed. That would be something that I would say, well, we probably ought to look at, and we can bring, an additional bill. This by no means, in my opinion, is the end all and the only bill that should be brought with regards to what we've learned. And so that's how I would answer that. I just don't have a better answer for you this time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that's a great answer, that you maybe want more discussion on removing something like that. My final question is on page 4, line 7, and I'll just start on line 6. It says, during any state of disaster emergency, the governor may not alter, adjust, or suspend provisions of the Idaho Code. And I think a suggested edit there was, or violate the Constitution, which our governor did and was not challenged on. And I'm wondering why you would choose to leave that out, or if you'd be opposed to amending to put that in, being as that was a major issue.
Just Representative Scott, if you'll look up a couple of lines, you will see that the United States Constitution or the Constitution of the state of Idaho, that's on line 3 and on line 4. So it is already in there.
Thank you.
Yep. Any further questions for Representative Monks? Representative Barbieri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Monks. Yeoman's work here, Representative, really appreciate how hard you worked on making sure that this language was included and working with the Senate to make sure that we may have something that's going to be able to pass over there. Just to focus a little bit on ending the declaration of emergency. I understand it is your position that passing this will then immediately end the declaration of emergency. Can you give me some idea in terms of your discussions with others, the Senate and leadership, House members, and the rest of it? First of all, what effect that will have on some of the health district mandates, some of the things that are doing in terms of separation? What actual on-the-ground effect do you expect this to have once we pass it and we end that declaration of emergency?
Representative Monks.
Thank you, Chairman. And maybe before I answer that question, you're giving me way too much credit on this bill. This was a collaborative bill with a lot of people, yourself obviously very included with that, and that I appreciate all the comments and recommendations that we've seen on this. And so I'll just make sure that is fully understood. Many on this committee, and even those that are not on this committee within this body, worked on this legislation, and so I want to make sure that this was not a single person effort, though. Thank you, Representative Barbieri. As far as a little clarification, maybe, and my mistake if I didn't clarify this fully. This will apply to any disaster after 30 days have expired from that, which means it has to be 30 days old before it would expire. So if it goes into effect, this would be the law of land because it has the emergency clause. And so then when any declared emergency has hit its 30 days, if it has not already, then it would expire at that particular time. Now, what that would mean, the way I see this, is we have currently, I think, about 8 emergency declarations existing right now that have been extended, re-upped, so to speak, every 30 days for several years. Those all would expire at the passage of this particular legislation. So I think all of them would if they were declared under this section of code. Keep in mind, there is another section of Code 601 that I am aware of at least one emergency disaster declaration underneath that section of code. That one, nothing would happen to that one because it was written under a different section of code unless we change something in Section 601, which I think, well, I'll just leave it at that because I can't talk more on that. But I've already gotten a lot of privileges to speak on 2 pieces of legislation at once, and I'll just leave it at that. So that's what would happen. I'll be up here again on something else, and maybe I can address that in another conversation shortly thereafter.
Thank you, Representative Monks. And just for your edification, Representative Barbieri, the issue with 601 is being dealt with in the Senate currently. Representative Gannon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative Monks, for all your hard work. But I do have a question, and that is on this concurrent resolution on page 2. Talk about a concurrent resolution can modify, can essentially direct the governor what to do, and that's lines 12 through 20. I'm just wondering whether that would be circumventing the legal the statute making process, the bill making process, to such an extent that it would not be enforceable. Because I'm just thinking that the governor has, if you go through the bill process, the governor has the right to veto, and there's the check and balance that you have the 2/3 of the legislature has to override the veto. And I'm just wondering, it seems like all of a sudden the legislature is becoming the executive if you do these things by concurrent resolution, because the governor is left out of that process, or the office of the governor is left out of the process. And it seems like suddenly the legislature is the executive branch. You're dictating what can and can't be done without the executive branch being included as the Constitution contemplates. Any thoughts on that? And I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just reading through this, and I'm just thinking out loud, kind of.
Representative Monks.
Thank you, Chairman, and Representative Gannon. Thank you. Good question. So currently, the legislature has the ability to terminate executive orders by way of concurrent resolution. We attempted that during the special session in August. That ability already exists for us to be able to terminate. Now, your question as far as modifying a emergency declaration and how does that fit within those separation of powers, I'd kind of back up a little bit and remind us what an emergency declaration is doing. We're already saying we're changing the way we've always set up something. We've set up a law. The governor has either passed it or somehow the law has become effective, or a rule that's come through this body by a constitutionally guaranteed process where we're allowed to review those, accept them, or reject them. Those have gone through a process. Now we're saying during an emergency, he can wipe those out for a period of time. So for us to have a say again back into that, I think is wholly appropriate. I think the fact that we had an agreed upon set of rules between the governor and the legislature on whatever it happened to be, septic tank inspections or something to that effect. And we had a disaster to where we couldn't get to those, we couldn't do those anymore. Remember, that was an agreed upon rule, and we're giving him power to say by himself, he can suspend those. We're not gonna do those anymore. And so for the legislature now to have an ability underneath that declared emergency, again, he's declared it, he started that process. For us to have some say back into the matter, I do think is appropriate. But it is a good question, and I do appreciate your line of thinking, and I think that's a concern and a good way of looking at that situation.
Any further questions for Representative Monks? Representative Gannon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one follow-up on that. Yeah, and so I understand the power, the legislature wants to get involved, and the legislature is involved in bills and laws that we pass. But in this particular case, it looks like all the authority is being transferred to the legislature, and you're leaving the executive out because of the power of the legislature to modify, terminate, extend the state of emergency. It's kind of like, well, we can do it. We can do what we want. The legislature saying the legislature can do what it wants by concurrent resolution, and as we know, the governor is not involved in a concurrent resolution, and so it seems like the executive branch powers that are in the Idaho Constitution are being transferred by this language, or by this process would be better, are being transferred to the legislature, and the governor isn't involved. So that's and I don't know whether that would be proper.
Thank you for that comment. Is there further questions for Representative Monks, or did you want him? Is there a question in there, Representative Gannon?
No, it's just a conversation.
No, perfect.
Just,
Great conversation. Great comments.
Just trying to figure out how this is going to work and whether it's lawful or not.
Certainly, I understand.
And I'm not expressing a thought either way. It just seems like
You're just
there may
musing
be a
about it.
problem.
Yeah, no, it's great. Representative Mathias, appears you have a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Monks, I have two questions for you, and I want to appreciate all the work you've put into this and for talking with me previously about this. So there's still just two things that I want to clarify. We already reserve the right to end an emergency declaration whenever we see fit. Given the administrative complexity that accrues downstream from a governor's declaration, all of the sub-state entities that have to start putting all of this work into play, since we already preserve this right to end the declaration, why must we take away from the governor the ability to renew emergency declarations, which will make sure there's never gaps, and which will make sure that this body doesn't have to prop up additional administrative bodies to stay abreast of the situations long enough to know whether we should renew an emergency?
Representative Monks.
Thank you, Chairman and Representative Mathias. And I too really appreciate the conversations and frankly the courtesy. Representative Mathias has always kind of given me heads up on what questions he's going to ask me ahead of time, and that
I don't know
that's
how
very
you arranged that, because he did not do that on my legislation.
That's-
So you got to deal me in.
kind,
Yeah.
very kind, and I do appreciate that, and looking forward to working together on a lot of different stuff over the years. But so I wrote down a question. That's why I wrote them down, because I would have forgotten already by what you'd asked. Why take away that ability? I think the legislature, this legislation, and the way I would answer that, this legislation makes the legislature do a lot more work than it had. And maybe in situations where we would look at it and go, there's really no need for us to do that. Why do we need to spend the time and effort to extend a emergency that everybody essentially, I mean, I'm using that a little loosely, agrees with, and that can probably extend for over a year or two, and I'll give you some examples about that later on today. And you're right, it does seem like that might be a little bit much. We had those discussions a lot as far as, do we really want to get ourselves involved in every one of these things? And I think the answer was, we as a legislature, at least I feel sometimes we've been maybe a little lax in our duties. I think, and not just this issue. I mean, I can list several issues where I think we've been maybe a little lax. I think in the rules, promulgation, in that whole area, we have written laws such that they require rules to define how the law is supposed to work. And I know this isn't exactly your, I'm stepping around your question slightly, but where we have done that, we've given authority over to the executive branch and said, go ahead and write rules on this, and yeah, we'll check them and we'll review them and everything, but we didn't have to do that. We probably shouldn't have. Sometimes that's very appropriate. Sometimes I think that's the right thing to do, but oftentimes we have just handed over our authority. And I think when you do that and then you try to take it back or try to rebalance that, sometimes we may grab a little more than we really needed to in order to get that pendulum to swing back. Did we grab too much here? Arguably. Does that mean it's going to stay that way? No. Is there going to be other bills that are going to address this? Yep. I would be surprised if next year we didn't have, or later this year, have something that looks at this exact very issue and go, you know what, there's a different way or a better way of doing that. But I think in light of this, what we've experienced over the last year, this was the choice, at least within the group of individuals that I consulted with on this, that we said that's what we want to do. We do want to be that involved. We're willing to do that because we think that that's our responsibility and duty to do that. But you got a good point. I do.
Representative Mathias.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick follow-up. Do we have any assurances that if we end this declaration, that FEMA dollars will continue to flow to our counties and cities that are using them to deal with the pandemic?
Representative Monks.
Thank you, Chairman. You know, that's kind of the million-dollar question, I think, and depending on who you ask, you'll get a different answer as far as what really is at stake. I don't know if that's the right word, or what would happen if we did that. I know there's several people within this committee here itself that have presented bills that address ending these emergencies and what would happen with those dollars, what would happen with vaccinations. I've asked some people who I think are pretty high up in the organizations that have good say on that, and I've been told some things as such as, all we're going to lose is the 75% match for our National Guard members, and the hospitals could lose an additional 6% bonus that they're receiving on some Medicaid stuff. I've also heard that you're putting in jeopardy CARES dollars, PPP loan information, vaccination distributions. So I've heard the gamut of what's at stake. So good question. I don't necessarily know that answer at this point. We're asking it. We're asking everybody we can to give us a different answer, but everybody taints it a little bit differently with what they want the end result to be. But we can extend them very easily with a concurrent resolution. That's what we can do. We don't have to end it. We have the ability to extend those in perpetuity as long as we want. So we're not necessarily saying we're cutting everything off, we're not doing anything else. No, we're just saying we as a legislative body get to decide that. And so, yes, good question. Yes, I don't know that answer yet, because if I've talked to General Rishi, or I talk to, the governor's office, or if I talk to, somebody at IACI, or you name it, I'm getting a different answer. And so I don't know what's completely at stake, but I do know it puts the legislature with 105 of us the ability to make that decision. And I think that's a better decision than leaving it with one person on whether or not we decide to do that.
Thank you, Representative Monks. Any further questions? Hearing none, we're going to open up testimony on House Bill 1 to members of the public. First up on our sign-up sheet is Matthew Jensen.
Mr. Chairman, representatives, my fellow Idahoan.
Matthew, Oh, just to be clear, in this committee, we'll allow 2 minutes for public testimony, so make sure you stay inside that parameter. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, representatives, my fellow Idahoans, my name is Matthew K. Jensen. I am the District 17 Republican Vice Chairman, resident of Boise, and I'm about 100% there with this bill. This is the very kind of thing that regular, everyday Idahoans have been asking for since last March. Now, if you'll indulge me, this whole diversion is going somewhere, I promise. Over the past 2 regular legislative sessions, I've noticed the euphemisms that legislators have used for different things and people, most notably how the governor is referred to as the gentleman on the second floor. You should be aware, however, of the different ways the governor is now referred to, even by the people that had fervently supported him before his election. Most of these are pretty crude, and some are direct but unrepeatable references to the very actions that this legislation is trying to prevent. And we need this bill now, and not only should you send it to the floor, with a do-pass recommendation, but you should make it clear to the bad word I cannot say in this room on the second floor that if you could have done this sooner, you would have. We have laws for a reason, and with that, I will yield my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Matthew. Great job. Any questions for Matthew Jensen? Thank you, Matthew, for being here. Matthew is the only individual we had on our sign-up sheet today. Greg, is there anybody that would like to testify remotely? No one testify remotely. Is there anyone in the audience today that would like to testify in the legislation? If so, come forward and state your name, who you represent. You'll have 2 minutes.
I just want to make sure, Chairman, is this the one for H0001? Is this the bill that we're talking about?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All righty. Thank you so much, Senators and or House Committee. Thank you so much for your time. My name is Margie Baker, and I am very in favor of this bill. And I do want to state that this is why. I'm short, sorry. It says here, I've been really going over this, and I really appreciate that we could have this time. Let me get to my notes here. I want to make sure. It says, dependence and independence, you belong to God, soul, body, and spirit. Your mind belongs to God, and your talents belong to Him also. No one has a right to control another's mind and judge for another, prescribing what is his duty. There are certain rights that belong to every individual in doing God's service, and no man has any more liberty to take these rights from us than to take life itself. God has given us freedom to think, and it is our privilege to follow our impressions of duty. We are only human beings, and one human being has no jurisdiction over the conscience of another human being. Each one of us has an individuality, an identity that cannot be surrendered to any other human being. We are individually the workmanship of God. And to the legislators that are here today, it is your duty, and I really appreciate this bill that Monks has worked really hard to do, because it is all you collaboratively to be able to work on, making decisions of what the power the governor has. And so I just want to tell you that I appreciate this. At this time, I yield my time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Margie. Margie, because we only had 2 minutes, I'm assuming, was that your testimony you were reading?
No, I have more.
No, that's fine. If
But-
you want to have that in the minutes, you can give that to the page, and we'll make sure
Yes.
that gets put in the minutes.
Yes. I didn't know how to time myself, but I do have more on there, but I will give you a copy of mine.
Katie will come and get that from you.
Thank you.
Anyone else wish to testify today? Gentleman in the back, if you'd come forward, state your name and who you represent. You'll have 2 minutes.
My name is Stephen Kaiser. I live in Boise. I represent myself and my neighbors. In our neighborhood, we are strongly in favor of having a bill like this as soon as possible. We recognize that the state has gotten way out of balance, where one man has yielded for himself way too much power. He's actually lined out some laws that have been put in place by prior legislative meetings. And I'm thankful that the legislature is willing now to take the power back for yourselves on behalf of the people. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Any questions for David? Hearing none. Next up, a gentleman in the front with the red tie. State your name, who you represent. You'll have 2 minutes.
My name is Casey Baker. I thank you, Sir Chair, and the committee members for allowing us the opportunity to testify here today. I'm from Napa, and I'm pro this bill. I would like to see it passed, but I would like to suggest a few changes, alterations. First is page 2, line 15, reading, "The legislator may extend the state of emergency for any number of days." I respectfully request that any number of days be replaced with a number less than 60 days. And page 3, lines 17 and 18, after the restrictions on movement and family holiday gatherings experienced in the current state of emergency, I suggest that these lines be struck. And I think that was mentioned by Monks when he was up here, something to that effect, or you talked about those lines also, I believe. And page 3, line 50, reading, whereas verse 1 of Romans chapter 13 establishes God as the highest power which to be subject to, and verse 5 states, "Wherefore ye must needs be subject not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake." I would respectfully therefore request that the words "according to the dictates of conscience" be added to line 50, including but not limited to the right to assemble for worship according to the dictates of conscience. And we read in Genesis 1:31 through chapter 2, verse 3, the following. "And God saw everything that he had made, and it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day." Genesis 2:1 starts, "Thus the heavens and the earth were..."
Mr. Baker, your time is up.
Okay.
If you'd like to have your testimony submitted to the record, Katie the page would be happy to get that. Thank you for coming to testify today. Is there anyone else that would like to testify? Young lady in the front row, if you'll come forward, state your name and who you represent. You'll have 2 minutes.
My name is Maggie Goff. I'm in District 13, Nampa, Idaho, and I am a child of God. And I just wanted to mention that it was pointed out that we already have the ability to end the state of emergency, but in June, there was only 15 legislators that came to the Capitol to actually do that. And so even though supposedly the ability is there was a lot of discussion. Was it constitutional? Was it not constitutional? Some members were consulting this constitutional attorney and others were consulting, and we ended up with only 15 people and nothing was able to be done. So I do think this legislation is necessary because you need to be called in, all 105, to debate and to go through the process and not leaving it up to who's going to show up and who's not. Thank you.
Margie, thank you so much. Any questions for Margie? Hearing none. Is there anyone else in the committee that would like to testify today? If not, Representative Monks will have you come forward. And there was no negative testimony, but you're welcome to put a bow on this and tie it up, and then we'll take action on it.
You've probably heard from me too much already, and you're going to hear from me shortly again.
Let me give you 2 minutes.
And so no, I don't have anything really else to add at this point. I mean, just to point out, you know, I think we identified quite a few concerns during the last 10 months, and this is a start. This is not the end. This is just a start of what we need to look at and do. And so I appreciate the opportunity this committee gave me to present this, and would just ask for your support. And again, I guess the option would be the committees on how they would handle the House Bill 1 and this RS as well.
Okay.
And
I'll
Chairman,
give you a
do
chance.
you want me back here?
I'll give you a chance, just because in the off chance we have a roll call vote. I'll give you a chance to return to your seat, Representative Monks. The committee, the House has properly before it House Bill 1. Representative Palmer.
Mr. Chairman, if I might explain what I'm about to attempt to do.
Certainly.
For those of you within the sound of my voice, we have 2 bills before us, which is not a everyday occurrence around here. I'm going to make probably 2 motions if the chair would like, one for House Bill 1 and then one for the RS. So the RS is basically is replacing House Bill 1, so we've had a full hearing on it. So my first motion would be to hold House Bill 1 in committee. And then do you want to vote on that one, or do you want to make both motions at the same time?
So, Chairman Paul, or Representative Palmer, it's your intent to hold House Bill 1, and then what is your intent to do with the RS?
My intent would be to make a motion to introduce RS 2868 and send it to the second reading since we've had a full hearing.
So for freshmen that are on the committee, just the motion that he's made, the Representative Palmer's made, would be to hold House Bill 1. It would stay in the possession of the committee. He would replace it then with RS 28268. He would make the motion to introduce and send to the second reading calendar so we don't go back through a full hearing. It would expedite the process and get the bill moving forward. Is there discussion on the motion to hold House Bill 1 in committee? Hearing none. All in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, nay. The motion is carried and House Bill 1 will be held in committee. The committee will now have in consideration RS 28268. Representative Palmer.
Mr. Chairman, I would move that we introduce RS 28268 and send to the second reading.
The motion is to introduce RS 28268 and send it to the second reading calendar. Is there discussion on that motion? Representative Hanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say I appreciate the hard work that has been done to get this moved for the people. They're demanding it. We need to do it. So thank you, all of you who've worked so hard to get this through. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you. Representative Gannon.
No, I don't have a comment.
Okay. The motion is to introduce RS 28268 and send to the second reading calendar. I'm sorry, Representative Mathias. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm opposed to this motion. I have two serious concerns. One is that I think this is a serious departure from our tradition of due diligence in emergencies. When I went back and researched the history of every time we've looked at this statute, the first thing that jumped out at me is we have never cracked this statute open during an emergency. We've always focused on the ball, handled the threat, and then after we've had a chance to catch our breath and reflect, then we've decided that now's the time to undertake a comprehensive evaluation of that balance. Secondly, and I think this is probably a little bit more practical, we've put all of our eggs in the vaccine basket. No mask mandates, social distancing, we're talking about lifting the cap on gatherings, and I'm concerned that if we say publicly we don't think COVID is an emergency, we don't think it's a threat, that the new federal administration will say, then we're not going to send vaccines to Idaho until we handle everyone else. That's a serious concern of mine. So I'll be voting no.
Certainly. Thank you, Representative Mathias. Is there further discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Would you like to be recorded as voting no? Representative Mathias and Representative Gannon would like to be on the record for voting no.